Hello, and welcome to Varblog. And here, welcome to Evacuations, where we dig into text as a community. My first two guests, Jason and Jeremy, are people from my larger community. I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a minute. And you will be seeing many of these where we take text that I want to cover more thoroughly, or want multiple perspectives on, not just my own, and kind of parse them together on this new series here. You've already seen one of these on the channel. Uh, it was previously a nailing it down subset. We decided for clarity's sake that I needed to do some more specific branding. It's weird as a Marxist having to do branding all the time, not gonna lie. But Jason, introduce yourself.
Hey, Varn, thanks for having me. For everyone out there, my name is Jason. As far as what I guess would be a relevant introduction, I'm a Marxist. I am a unionist professionally. Without naming my employer, I'm a policy analyst, but I have a background in education, in political science with a focus on political theory. I'm a union activist, elected leadership of my sublocal, something of a local organizer and such. That's how I met Jeremy, through kind of Portland organizing and such. And yeah, I'm just stoked to be here and kind of nerd out and chew the fat on this with you guys. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And Jeremy, my audience has probably met you before, but introduce yourself.
Hey everybody, Jeremy. Some of you have seen me chatted with me either on the Discord, or if you're hanging around on, say, like a lot of like This Is Revolution stuff, you'll see me helping out with their live, well, both the live show, but also in the movie streams and here and there. I had sort of used to do a podcast called Giving the Mic to the Wrong Person, which the two other interlocutors above me have both guested on multiple times, talk about all sorts of interesting and esoteric stuff. But I kind of, I don't know, being a one-man operation on a podcast for, God, it was 5 years. Jesus, it will grind you down real quick. So I kind of like put everything on pause. And now I'm just kind of a affiliated commenter, and or not really a shit poster, more of just a, whatever, more of like somebody who just posts stuff and say, hey, check this out.
Yeah. As a person who's been a podcaster for, God,
Longer than I have.
13 years, it is draining, particularly when you work by yourself. So, but for the longest time, Jeremy, if you looked up my name on the end of the first Google page, my shows with you would actually show up. So,
Wow,
um,
pretty good, eh? Wow, SoundCloud is better SEO than expected. Shit.
it does, and also you also mentioned my name in the title, so it helps. But we're talking here about Robert Bob Brenner and Dylan Riley's New Left Review article from November-December 2022, which has kind of sent the Marxist nerd world into some waves. And why I say that is because Bob Brenner is most famous for the infamous Brenner debates, which really kind of starts two new fields of Marxism. It distinguishes world systems theory and Marxism and political Marxism from each other, and also differentiates them from their previous ties with analytical Marxism. Those debates kind of set those three schools completely separate from each other. And I'm just going to lay out my cards here. In the Brenner debates, I tend to be partially a Brenner partisan because I've always had this whole, well, how do you explain why Spain didn't become a dominant capitalist power versus the Americas if it's just settler accumulation? There has to be some other component. The other component seems to be the specific pattern of reinvestment and what you're reinvesting in. which for the English is agrarian capital.
Spain was just kind of like, what would you describe it as? Kind of just national formation and just church weirdness.
No, I mean,
in such a ways that didn't happen in England.
No, it has nothing to do with church. It has everything to do with they reinvested into military technology.
Oh, okay.
And that was their primary reinvestment pattern. This is super controversial. Marx actually puts the foundation of capitalism in a footnote. It's in a fucking footnote, like so many fucking things in Marx.
Standard academic practice, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, except it's pre-academic standard practices as we know now.
Okay.
But he puts the foundation of capitalism in Italy, and so does world system theorists in general, and so do a lot of Orthodox Marxists too. The problem with that is the reason why Marx does it is having to do with the abolition of serfdom in the city-states. The problem that you have with that is serfdom is kind of slowly abolished in England before then too, before anyone would say it was capitalist. Brunel, the sort of non-Marxist major theorist of world systems theory, because there's the Marxist branch and it's related but not quite Marxist branch, traces the foundations of capitalism in like monasteries. So make of that what you will. A lot of it has to do with definitions of capitalism more than like historical facts. So, and that's kind of important. But what I'm just going over this so you know who Bob Brenner is, because it's not relevant to this at all. Like, in fact, this surprises me in how much potential damage it does to Brenner's prior conceptions and categorizations of capitalism. So, but we'll get into that.
Just to I don't know, offer up some more, like, not really, let's say a little bit more prologue. What do you think prompted them to kind of to put this out, both Brenner and Riley?
I think they have to explain the kind of malaise that like the Jacobin left couldn't do. And I'm not here to pick on the Jacobin left or DSA, but I read the DSA's like, why has Biden winning left us in this malaise issue? I read it with the Regrettable Century podcast kids, and well, kids are older than me, but
also been on the show too. On the show too, and yeah. Anyway,
so, and we found it like, with the exception of Anton Yeager, whenever they got to a hard question, the Jacobin issue would posit it and then immediately avoid it. Like, be like, what's happened with the squad? Don't look. What do we do with Bernie? Don't look. Maybe we run him again in 2024. And I think Brenner and Riley are trying to explain that. I think they're also trying to explain something that a lot of people have been on for a little while. I've been been on this kick since about 2017, is that neoliberalism was kind of dying the moment the left really took it up as the primary enemy. But we don't really know what the fuck is going on right now, because the current economic situation has characteristics associated with neoliberalism, but a whole lot of characteristics that are not. And it's leading to like weird discussions about class. One of the things that you can clearly tell that they're trying to deal with is like, we don't think the PMC thesis explains the current situation. They don't say that explicitly, but it seems very much in their thesis 1 and in some of the things they talk about in their intro that they're trying to deal with. But that there is a there. There's something going on that we have to understand and that we don't. I think that's driving them. I also think trying to figure out like the current left narrative about the end of the Trump administration, where it really drops off the rails. I mean, and it is sort of the irony, like we have this resistance period of against Trump for, most of his tenure, but he only, He only really breaks the mold of Republican presidents in a true way during the COVID months. That's when stuff really gets weird. And they do try to posit a thesis about why that happened, like beyond just, he's irrational and his base is irrational and he's pandering to conspiracy weirdos, which is also true. But why would he do it in the first place? Because they are trying to explain that, and then clearly they're also trying to explain why Biden did better than expected in the 2022 midterm elections, even though he didn't really do well, but he broke a generations-long trend going all the way back to 1992 of the Democrats sucking ass in midterms. Like, just historically, like the Democrats always just blow it in midterms. Like, Republicans blow it in midterms too, but the Democrats usually epically blow it in midterms, like in ways it's almost hard to explain.
What's your speculation for why?
I think they're actually partially right as to why it went better. The Democrats' primary base is, despite the fact they always talk about like basically educated black women, their primary base is graduate degree holders, and they vote in midterms. They're highly motivated. Where the Republican base, after you get beyond baby boomers, is not highly motivated to vote in midterms. So it also means that we're probably not like, he doesn't say this, but this is implied. We're probably not likely to see the same results in 2024 that we expect from the 2022 election, because we don't really know who's going to come out based off the midterms and current demographics, because it's going to be different.
The future is unwritten, but the end is always near. As the old line goes.
And I think he does start off. I say he. Actually, I don't know what's here is Riley and what's Brenner, which is going to be a fun speculation to go who is who and what is what. But he does make an observation that I think I wish that that Marxists really thought about more. And it's in the first fucking sentence, or in the first like couple of paragraphs, so I'll read it.
Go for it.
It's under section 1. For most of the 20th century, U.S. political parties represented different coalitions of capitalists who appealed to the working class voters on the basis that they would promote economic development, expand job opportunities, and generate revenues to invest in public goods. This was a material basis of consent that determined party success at the polls. A local version of the politics that shaped most capitalist democracies during the long post-war boom. In the U.S., this produced significant electoral swings and big congressional majorities for the winning side. Eisenhower in 1956, Johnson in 1964, Nixon in 1972, Reagan in 1980. He doesn't say that, but it's clear. That political landscape has now disappeared. Beginning in the 1990s, and definitely since the 2000s, Republican and Democrat rule alternate on the narrowest of margins. Winning an election no longer appealing to a vast shifting center, but hinges on turnout and mobilization of a deeply but closely divided electorate. Asterisks, I think this is a very interesting insight, but I also just want to point out that's not just the United States. That's literally, it's Western Europe, it's Latin America now. That trend has been kind of showing up in all the capitalist democracies around the world. So immediately I'm sort of like, well, that's a very interesting observation. And it's true, I think, that like we've had capitalist parties who would like convince people to vote for them based off of the way they will manage capital. And that any working class mass base is based off of the appeal of capital management.
Does this pattern hold up for, let's say, two examples that I can think of offhand are India and South Korea?
South Korea, yes. India, no. And
Okay.
so but the reasons for that are like super fucking complicated and actually beyond my purview. I don't feel comfortable actually saying why I think India's the odd man out there. But South Korea has been, in fact, I was there when Park, the daughter of the last dictator, won in a incredibly close and narrow election that resembled a U.S. style election.
Mm.
And then the opposition, the left opposition won after she was, ended her career in prison. And then the right is now a different right, actually. And one of the things about Korea that's a little different is there's a Buddhist right and a Christian right, and they're not exactly the same.
Interesting.
But there's a right that's kind of a kind of old guard, anti-communist right that's come back into power in South Korea today, but on like 1-2% margin. So in that sense, it's just like the United States. Modi's a little bit harder to deal with, and when it comes to like the middle class and above, from what I understand, it does look like the United States, but when you get beyond that, it does not at all. And that's probably because development patterns are really different in India. Only urban environments really kind of even come close to replicating what we're talking about here. But this is me spitballing. I don't feel comfortable like saying that as the reason, if there's any one reason at all. Jason, what's your take?
Yeah, I wouldn't even say that much. I definitely don't have any confidence to speak to India. Yeah, sorry. I wish I could, but
yeah, I feel comfortable speaking about Korea just because I lived there, and I lived there during an election. And I read Korean, so I like it's a little bit easier for me to comment on. Where it's like there's a lot of language. I mean, a lot of the Indian press is in English, but there's a lot of stuff you need to understand about India that I think makes it a much more complicated proposition.
Okay, yeah, I brought those two up just because I was curious how they, because there's kind of like two. Well, one literal like former colonial holding, and the other one kind of,
it's a former colonial holding of somebody, just not the West exactly.
Yeah. I'm just kind of curious, like how those patterns held up compared to, like, yeah, as you said, all the American and the Western European ones. So, that's all I brought that one up for.
Yeah, but Brazil and Mexico, for example, resemble these. Although Mexico is really a three-way race, not a two-way, which makes it more complicated. And AMLO's coalition is way more complicated than I think a lot of people in the United States comprehend. I also kind of get a little bit. I push back a little bit on David Griscom and Matt Riley for not over there at Left Reckoning for not really understanding how complicated AMLO's coalition has had to be, because it's basically based off of the political stagnation of the PRI and the fact that the PEN is deeply unpopular as well. And if, again, for people who don't know, the PRI is the Party Revolution Institutional. It's technically a socialist party, but it's kind of right wing. AMLO is kind of sui generis of himself, and he's also a descendant of one of the major figures of the Mexican Revolution, which complicates things pretty greatly. And he lost to the PAN in what he did not consider a legitimate election in the aughts, which I think is also kind of forgotten. And then the PAN is Vicente Fox seems like a liberal when he talks to Americans, but it's a right-wing party that was considered to the right of the PRI, but was also in good relations with it. So yeah, but it does like AMLO's coalition, because the social divide in Mexico is pretty close, has to be he has to include a few conservative elements to stay in power. So, and that's for the same reason. It's the electorate in Mexico is pretty evenly divided.
Okay.
And with Lula, similarly, Lula is personally quite popular, but the Workers' Party is actually barely holding on. And Bolsonarism seems to have overstated its hand in an attempted coup, but without any military support, really. But the electorate in Brazil is pretty closely divided. Even though Bolsonaro is unpopular, conservative to worker split is pretty. It's different than the United States. I've talked to Alex Hochuli about it, and he's make sure don't read it totally in terms of Trumpism versus Bidenism. Lula versus Bolsonaro is actually a different phenomenon. They have different class bases, etc. But the electorate is really closely divided. So it's becoming a trend And I think it's interesting. One of the things I think with these theses is, even though it focuses on the U.S., I think it is trying to come up with something that kind of describes what's happening in the capitalist world altogether, because you don't see people like winning with 70-80% of support anymore. That just doesn't seem to happen. And in Europe, that's led to like all kinds of weird fucking coalitions taking over. Like parties that have been established for 1 or 2 generations just collapsed. Particularly in like France, for example, like the socialist and the conservatives are not the people we're dealing with there anymore, because the electorate's so close, and these coalitions are trying to deal with that.
Yeah, weird. Like, no, yeah, just what is it? Just the Macron's kind of weird party of, who knows how long they're going to be driving things there.
No, and then you're left between Mélenchon and Le Pen, which are like the two outsider parties, really. Like it's the coalition of like different kinds of leftists that's replaced the socialist, and that's Mélenchon, and then like Le Pen's National Front, which has been a threat for a long time, but has really now kind of replaced conventional conservatism in France.
Yeah, 2 different generations of Le Pen too.
All right, so that's not. So, what do you make of that thesis, though, Jason? Like, just the thesis that Brenner and Raleigh are starting off here, that like that there was big wins for like one side or the other in the management of capital, because like workers saw their interest in different factions of capitalists. Like, what do you make of that thesis?
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. Like, you kind of jumped into where they lead off, and I'm trying to make sure I can give the quote here. Where is it? They say this. Just the words stuck out to me. Where is it at? Now I'm being that really bad guest. I don't know. They say, or maybe it's in my notes. Here we go. American politics has undergone a tectonic shift over the past 20 years, linked to deep structural transformations in the regime of accumulation. And, with them starting with that like initial point that, a tectonic shift over 20 years, like a lot of the stuff in this, I kind of nod along. Like I get what they're saying, but I don't know that I agree with the degree to which they think it is so. Like, I'm not sure what the tectonic shifts in the last 20 years are. I think they try to lay some of that out in policy examples and such. I don't know that all those connect. I mean, as far as the sort of like, to your question, sorry, I kind of went a long way around to that, but the so-called, shifting working class middle that went back and forth. I mean, the political scientist in me wants to say, well, there's just so many different variables now. We've seen without explanatory reasons, right? We've seen a decrease in engagement in party politics. We've seen a rise in candidate-centered politics as opposed to sort of platform or policy-centered politics, right? If I'm trying to look at it, I try to look at it in a 20-year window. So I think, all right, well, I'm turning 40 this year. So 20 years ago, like I was in college, that was like Kerry Bush, right? When Bush beat Kerry 20 years ago, do I feel that do I feel that there's been a tectonic shift since then? I mean, outside of COVID and some of the weird things we've seen with the pandemic, I'm not sure. And even in political science, there's always an argument about which way the change goes, right? Is it as above, so below, or so below as, vice versa, right? I think I just did a George Bush there and almost messed up the quote, but, I'm not sure I'm not sure that I would sit here and like go deep, blue in the face about why I think this sense of the middle, of this like fighting over the same middle has changed. I don't know that I could say, well, here's my material understanding of what that's based on, but, there's just, I don't know, there's so much at play. I think as we chew on I think as you go through the theses and you chew on a little bit, some of that comes out and counter to those points, but I don't look at this in the beginning and have like, yep, I buy it. I'm completely in, or like, oh, well, I have this strong, counter thought to this, as they start. So,
well, one of the thing I'll say is just I think it's interesting that they stop. You notice I added Reagan to their quote because it was actually true for Reagan, but that they stop it in 1972 and they don't pick it back up till like somewhere between the 90s and the aughts.
Yeah.
What happened in that interregnum? Yeah,
that interregnum is like the politics most of us was born in, and you're just not dealing with it like at all. The other thing that we can say that started probably in the 60s, actually, so it starts way before this, in the last major crisis of capitalism, is like partisan temperament sorting of liberal versus conservative, which are really not ideologies so much as like temperament markers, if we're completely honest.
Yeah, much more like sorted by vibes, even, or even like the I don't know, somebody was like, not to be reductionist, but I think even you have mentioned this at some point, but he talked about how with a certain strata of, I don't know if this is a political person or a political media creature, but it's like it almost is like personality and temperament determines like, I don't know what party affiliation at this point, or at least like what subsector of the particular parties they're going for, until you get above a certain level where it's just kind of where just they can find themselves at home in either one of them because they have enough money.
Right. I mean, well, here one thing that I think this doesn't deal with is partisan identity. Like we can both talk about the fact that like party politics has actually vastly declined, but partisan identity has vastly increased, which is a weird that's a weird thing to explain. Like people are less involved in their political parties than ever before, but they more strongly identify with that party for whatever, even though like there's no real policy or even in some cases strong identity markers anymore. I mean, you can talk about like Republicans are the party of white people, except one of the things that'll come up against is if you like look at Pew polls, for example, the whitest political ideological demographic is progressives by a lot, actually. Yeah. So it just, these things don't really hold out when you start digging into the numbers. But I also find just their selection of years interesting, and like we're not even very far in, and we're going into the weeds. But I think it's important here. Eisenhower in 56, but not in 52. We skip Kennedy. We don't want to deal with the Kennedys because I think it actually probably does not fit this pattern.
Well, that's it. The kicker about this pattern is that they are the three examples given are the Johnson one. You can have much, but they're effectively like, they're not quite, they're like
the re-elections.
Yeah, they're re-elections. Yeah, they're all re-elections.
Yeah,
where Reagan having a far more dominant re-election victory than his election one. And I'm curious. Like, Bill Clinton not mentioned here.
Well, it's interesting the glossing over the 90s because I lean to 94 in the so-called Gingrich revolution as, I guess if I were to agree that, that things have shifted tectonically as their words, I mean, I would go back to that. I would go back 30 years to 92 or 94 and, kind of to my half point about as above, so below. I mean, what the Gingrich revolution really did in sort of institutional terms was politics changed. Like that's when the Republicans said, we don't really give a shit about anything other than power, right? Like we want political power because political power is how you make shit happen, right? So the conservative agenda, if it's going to succeed, it's going to need political power. And that began, in Washington with changes in congressional norms and congressional traditions and congressional procedures. And they shifted their campaigning style and their whole approach to politics. Republicans in 94, there was this coast to coast investment in local offices, right? Get any asshat Republican you can. How many local water district boards don't even have candidates, right? Run for that. Take that spot, get into politics, gain influence, gain power. And when we talk about this sort of deep, I hate the word, but deep tribalism that's always still there. I like the sort of sports analogy in this a lot. It's like, I don't really give a shit about anything other than my team winning, right? And my team winning means my team has power. And I think that's what, if there's anything that I think you can find loads and loads and loads of academics, research, and bloggers and articles and stuff, it's that shift in that understanding. Jeremy, I've talked about this all the time. I'll have too many beers and I'll just complain about how Democrats don't understand power. Like, they just fundamentally don't understand what power means, which I might be part of the guy that Brenner's talking about in thesis 5 or 6 there about the illusions of leftists. But, just like that's the shift to me, I think, is when Gingrich and that team, if you will, they had a vision. I think part of where the right is today, politically, not ideologically, but politically, I think those seeds are planted there, and that's your decimation of the illusion. I think of it, I don't know if illusionary is the right word, but this sort of idealized center that the two sides fought over post-war. I don't think it is what we typically think it is, but I think that approach, in 94, the conservatives, the hard right, changed their tactics. And I think that's when the dissolution of that style and that practice of politics changed.
Although,
and they don't even, they can't engage it here, right? Like, it's not, they're just kind of glossing over the 90s and well, shit's just been weird.
Right.
Let's gloss over it.
Part of that's because, like, in the Gingrich Revolution, you actually see what the rhetoric going all the way back to Goldwater was.
Mm-hmm.
But that Goldwater and Reagan didn't actually run the party that way. Like, they used that rhetoric, but they didn't actually expect to deliver on it. I mean, for all the horribleness of Reagan, he was a coalition builder. In fact, and in many ways, and I think a lot of leftists have and a lot of liberals even more so, have misunderstood this. There's a tribalism in the Republican and conservative side, but also ideologically, it's been more fractured particularly since Bush, than the liberal left side was until the second part of the Obama administration. Like,
mm-hmm.
That's when all the Marxists came back. So, I mean, it was pretty lonely as being an early Marxist adopter in 2008. I'll tell you that. And there's a couple other things that's just brackets out. The fundamental change in election laws between 1968 and 1982.
Mm-hmm.
And then the change again in the 90s to make sure that Ross Perot never happened again. That's bracketed out. The fact that every one of the things that they mentioned the re-election campaign, so they mentioned incumbency, but incumbency is still strong. And the area they skip, which is like 74 to 80, which is the other big area, that's when incumbency didn't matter. And the reasons for that are complicated. Like Gerald Ford was never really elected to any executive office. He even down ticket. And Carter was a weirdly, semi-incompetent candidate, and he got also hit an economic problem that hadn't hit an American president since modern media. But they have to bracket that out because there's a major political and economic crisis in the 70s. So why, like, when you stop at 72 and then like pick it back up in like, let's say, I guess 2000, it's like, well, you're actually leaving out the entire period of the beginning of the neoliberalism for real, though. Mm-hmm. Like, it's just like, we're not talking about that. And every period that we are talking about, that's all Fordist stuff and the end of Fordism. Like, so even from a deep structural, like, there's another deep structural, like, chasm you guys are just skipping. Like, you're just jumping over it. Like, the 70s through the 90s were weird, and also neoliberalism happened. I don't know. That's when all our careers started, but we're not going to talk about it. One
of the points I think you brought up earlier that I would thought about in terms of increasing amounts of partisan identification, but like a plummeting of partisan or party activity, is that it's almost like it seems like it's a mix of and this might be glib, but almost like it's the after effects of deliberately trying to they demobilize and depoliticize a lot of people, and but at the same time, so but at the same time, so it's like, not only do you is it better not to have all these people like really actively screwing around with the party stuff and maybe upselling someone's apple cart, but at the same time you have the same time you have the bullying alone phenomenon happening, where things are getting much more atomized and things are falling apart. But at the same time, you have the change and even more increasing dominance of like media, just fire hosing everybody all the time, and that seems like a very good way of instantiating, just kind of like taking political struggle from like people arguing into a room to more of like it's something that's stuck in your head, because you are subject to all of this stuff being fire hosed at you at the same time, when all of the real world's more things that would actually more anchor you have been either stripped away, or just that shit just doesn't work anymore.
So again, this is back to your analysis though, because that trend starts in the 70s.
Yeah.
Like both, like, yeah, you don't get 24-hour news media until the 90s, but you get 24-hour media starting towards the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s.
Yeah.
You also get, like, another thing that this doesn't deal with is like the demobilization. I mean, one of the things about right now that's so interesting is like no one believes in politics anymore, but more people vote. In the 80s and 90s, we started seeing massive declines of people voting, and that continued up and through the aughts. And then the Obama election does end that. That ends that trend. Like, so that's like, because I'm like, okay, one thing you have to deal with is the fact that like a whole lot of working class people in particular have not been voting in strong numbers for like decades, and they started voting again towards the Obama towards the Obama administration. That's not talked about in this at all either. So like there's a whole transition that they're basically like, it's like they want to jump from Fordism to now, and they don't call it Fordism, but from Fordism to now without dealing with all the interim in between. I mean, like, particularly when you look at how they're selecting this. And yeah, that's weird.
You think they at least want to cover that just to just to like shore up the argument, if nothing else, or at least to help to help shore it up some, or like strengthen it in the how does that argument hold up, trying to process, applying it to each of those stages to the extent that you can kind of think of an actual stage.
Right. So then they say that we have a new stage, but since we bracketed the prior stage out of the discussion, it's kind of weird. So it's hard to know, like, I think there is a there. Like they're calling political capitalism, which I think is a terrible name, and we'll get to that later. Because they're not the only person who uses it, and it means different things in different people's mouths.
Perfect. That's just perfect. Yeah, that always helps clarity. Yeah.
I guess it's to get away from the whole techno-neo-feudalism argument, which was even dumber. But Brenner was kind of associated with, but he's moving away from that.
But, that was the whole like we're moving back to feudalism in it he had, right?
Right. Yeah.
But in some of the same pieces where he's kind of making that argument, he would conclude with well, maybe it's a new stage or a new epoch or a new phase of capitalism, but it sure, wink, wink, feels like a return to feudalism. But yeah.
Right. Well, the big thing that's happened between the feudalism and this is the Fed started, indirectly busting up the tech rentiers, like not even meaning to, like, but that means that whole idea that there's a whole new economy just based on tech rents. It's just it took like two interest rate points to collapse it. So
I'm still kind of curious what all the money, even though everything was overvalued, but like there's, it seems like there's still like a lot of money getting poured into that shit. It's like, where does that actually go now that to what extent anything can be kind of balloon being popped, or kind of like the illusion.
Fictitious capital is fictitious, Jeremy.
I guess that's true.
There's nothing productive undergirding it, so you can't valorize it once the political context there. Which is also like, we'll get into this because this actually matters for this argument that they're making, because it's way down. But Bidenism is Keynesianism without growth, and I'm like, so Bidenism is Keynesianism that doesn't work. I've said that over and over again, but like Keynesianism's central premise is that you use like government spending to grow and moderate against economic shifts so that you can have continuous controlled growth. Yeah. And if you don't have growth at all, the fundamental premise of Keynesianism isn't true anymore.
Yeah, I remember even like in high school hearing it like described as just the wartime era. Always they described it as like pump priming.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it's funny, as we're thinking about this and we're talking about this, my mind's kind of tracing through history, and it's like, again, like they're talking about this new period with by skipping the 2 decades or so before that seems to have been another period. Like, do we just wave our hands and go, neoliberalism, but like, there certainly is a stark shift and a start, to the, a particular way of redistribution of wealth with Reaganomics, right? An upward redistribution. And, as Varn, I think you're a millennial with me, right? But,
I'm a borderline millennial Gen Xer. I'm actually I'm 42, so I'm
okay. So so I mean, like, our entire adult lives have been what feels like one economic crisis after another. And it's going to be hard to have, when you talk about that middle again, it's like, well, there was a lot of economic stability, relatively speaking, in the post-war Fordism and Ike and all that. Like, if you go post-war to Reagan, there's far more consistency and stability, I think, economically speaking, than we've seen from Reagan to now. So it's not that there's not something material there to say that, well, here's a fundamental, concern, that we should have in this analysis. But, and I don't think, and I don't know how much this, for me personally, I think the Obama presidency too, I don't think we can underestimate, or I don't think I don't know that we're far enough removed yet to have enough the sort of 30,000 foot view, but I don't think you can underestimate how much like the black guy changed things too, right? Like you said about how working class voting turnout was way down, and then it's suddenly gone up in the last, 3-4 cycles. It's like, well, the black guy is going to bring a lot of people out to vote who otherwise wouldn't have voted, right? You know what I mean?
Right.
And as you guys were mentioning, like media has changed in that 30-year window, and a lot of politics is way more ideologically speaking as well. In particular, I would say it's way more passive. It's like a consumption. Like politics is something we consume, right? Like you said, like, because I mean, like between like working class people just working too damn much and then not having time or energy or money to do anything after that, it's a very passive thing. Like I sit at home. Fox News launched in 96. I sit at home as a conservative and I watch that shit, and that really shapes a lot of things and shapes my activity and shapes my ideology, my mindset on these things. And the black guy being a president, I mean, you think back to like Bush Kerry. I mean, why did people like Bush? Like how much of liking of Bush was he's a guy that I can have a beer with, right? So like the shift, and they talk about this, and maybe stop me if I get too far ahead, but the sort of PMC element of liberalism today, right? This elitism and credentialed, I'm credentialed labor, right? I have college degrees, but I am a worker. I am in the working class, this sort of emergence, and the conservatives seeing Democrats as elitists come with, I remember that as a young adult with Bush Kerry. Bush is the type of guy I can have a beer with, Kerry,
even though
Kerry's
he didn't drink anymore because he was dry.
Kerry's uptight and and weird and wonky, and then with Obama, like people didn't like this lawyer, college professor know-it-all, right? Like, I don't want to sit around with some smart-ass know-it-all elitist, right? Like, I want a regular guy as president. And that's a narrative, right? Like, that's a ideological framing that sort of gets reproduced in day-to-day life.
And I find it going all the way back to the mid-70s too, like that ideological framing of Republicans
it certainly emerges there,
being more closer to the working class because of like left liberal elitism. You start seeing it in the middle of the Carter administration.
Say Jimmy, yeah.
How much of that switch comes from the transfer from I guess, you could see it in the generational shift between H.W. Bush and W. Bush, from the Northeastern WASP Republican type, the Rockefeller type, to more of the Southwestern Sunbelt Reagan Goldwater type.
A lot of that, but I am going to point out for us being too politically determinist, because I actually do think sometimes ideology is a smokescreen.
Or like definitely a post hoc one, like after.
Yeah,
it's justifying shit.
One thing I will say about that is that there is a truth that the coalition of FDR loses about half of its coalition to the Republicans sometime in the mid-70s. And some of it's a Southern strategy, but some of it's also like literally the industries the parties are aligned with, because Republicans are highly aligned starting in the 60s and 70s with like extractive industry, Sunbelt production and stuff like that, and then also petty bourgeois stuff like small businesses. And Democrats increasingly get associated with banking and tech. We talk about the Atari Democrats from the 1980s.
Democrats, I was going to bring up that,
but I actually don't think that the financial elites being more aligned with the Democrats is actually true until, frankly, the Obama administration. Because it's not just that Obama put in a lot of the Clinton people back; he put a lot of the more conservative end of the Clinton people back, like Rubin, etc., Volcker, stuff like that, back into the Democratic Party, and so it made it feel like there was a way in which, Obama's going to discipline us for the excesses of the aughts, but he's also going to let us have a seat at the table, and the Republicans may or may not, because the economic interests of the country are divided. I think that's a real kind of like backstroke in addition to the narrative. I think the narrative stuff is true, but I think if you look at like when did the Democrats start getting a lot of big money donors, and when did they win? I got in an argument with Carl Bayer about this, because he's like, well, the Democrats won the working class. I'm like, in so much that you mean the working poor, you're correct.
Like with Biden,
Biden, you're correct. Also ignoring that they're still the least likely to vote of any demographic class-wise. But if you also look at more people who make over $100,000 a year vote Republican. However, the moment you hit $250,000 a year, it switches back to the Democrats.
Switches back, yeah.
And then once you get up to the like high levels of wealth, it seems to just fucking like it's arbitrary almost where people go, or if they even care at all.
Yeah, I mean they'll donate to both parties. So
they win. As an Oregonian, I love that. Yeah, I love that Phil Knight money going. Yeah, the biggest contributor to both. Well, not to get too into Oregon politics. Tina Kotek said no thanks, but he was given huge amounts to both the Republican and the third party candidate because he's like, whatever. I'm Phil Knight. I freaking own the state legislature anyways. I'll give it to whoever. I'll give it to them all. So whoever wins, I have them.
Right. So the idea that there is something's happening, like sorting out like different elements of capital who are being favored in these parties, right? But I don't think this like really explains it. I mean, the one thing that we can say, and I know this kind of makes a lot of our Jacobin friends really upset, but in America, political class is the lower you get on the political class, you tend Democrat. But you way more likely tend not to vote. And in like the kind of like gray area of American politics, like people who make over $100,000 a year but don't make a lot more over it, you're far more likely to be Republican. But still the biggest tell is if you have a college degree or not, and particularly how high that college degree goes. So something's like disconnected from the class politics in some primary way. And, you know, this is one thesis that they kind of, in their three critiques of leftism, I think they're kind of right about that one element. But I don't think they explain how that happened and why it's happening. Like, I still don't have a good answer from them. But anyway, so they call this political capitalism, and I think it's hard to like, okay, we have a new period of capitalism, but we're skipping over the relationship to Fordism, which is where we want to start as our like baseline. And I forget Baker, I think it's Brenner student, actually points this out. The baseline of American politics during Fordism is a historical aberration.
Based on because the socioeconomic circumstances were such a historical aberration in America, like, you know,
anywhere in the world. Actually, I can't find an example that's similar to the post-war conditions in the United States, which also makes the baby boomer so fucking weird.
Yeah, because you vote the production, but also the demographic onslaught, for lack of a better
way.
hitting it all at one, all at the same time in such a huge wave.
And the particular conditions of that production are important because I think both left and right misunderstand it. And by left, I mean Democrats. I don't mean Marxist. But
we'll get to that.
Yeah. One thing I will say about that is that the United States had 51% of the world's wealth at the end of World War II, but it had it because, not just because it took it. I mean, yes, it did some of that too. I mean, obviously the whole fucking continent's an empire, really. But also, even from that perspective, it's the only major place with infrastructure that has its infrastructure almost completely untouched by the war. And it's a symmetrical war. So that's also different than now, which is why like war does not bring profits anymore. For example, like people are like, oh, war is good for the economy, except it's not most of the time. It's literally World War II conditions are sui generously unique, and it led to this period where there is a spike in productivity and capitalist productivity in the 50s and early 60s. There's literally been no other society other than the beginning of the Soviet Union that's seen a similar spike in improvement. Actually, maybe, although 80s China.
I was going to say China. I say China has
the China's history have something in there, but yeah,
China has entered the chat, but in different ways.
But it's different, and it's not as extreme actually as what happens in the U.S. Because China still has to build up its infrastructure, even though it can piggyback off of everybody else's prior infrastructure, both Soviet and the West. But the United States didn't have to build it up; it just had it. And that is a very different scenario, and its state capacity had been built up. That is what had been built up in World War I and World War II. So but those conditions, there's no other country in the history of capitalism that had conditions like that, where there weren't major competitors. Like, yes, the other early capitalist powers in Europe had similar conditions but they were all competing with each other, and they had immiseration conditions kick in really fast. And somehow that led, like, we had a period from like 1950 to like 1974 where there really isn't a business cycle in a capitalist country. That's kind of unheard of. And the prosperity levels increase dramatically because not only can we make all this stuff for ourselves, but we build it and sell it to Europe and to Japan. And it doesn't really become a problem until like the late 60s when Germany and Japan start competing with the stuff we helped them build. And immediately we hit a problem. Like,
I was gonna say, well, at some point, it's even like you can even tell. It's like you could even tell an emblematic tale. It's like you could. It's almost. It's like you can tell this entire story just through automobile production. Especially when of like Japanese autos in actually I'm not so sure about what my hometown is Flint, Michigan, so it's there's a little bit of a history with this, but of just how the big three automakers changed. Well, not really changed, but how they reacted to the 70s, and the fact that now all of a sudden you did have competitors, and you weren't, and so they actually had to start changing some things around at the same time that manufacturing profitability was rapidly changing.
Yeah. I said Baker, it's Barker. Tim Barker's Origins Over Time actually pointed this out. He looked at the profitability rates, and then he saw that big spike in the 50s. So the norm, and to be fair, for Riley and Brenner, like every fucking American politician also norms us. They think all of our social norms come basically from the 50s and from the post-baby boomers. It's so much so that institutional memory of like what America was like before the baby boomers is largely gone.
Did you ever read Stephanie Kuntz's book, The Way We Never Were?
Yes, it's a good book.
I have. It's been on my shelf for like 10 years. I really need to read it. But yeah.
Yeah, basically, we project back from even people who lived through that period project back from the 50s norms back into the 20s, teens, and 30s to some degree. So, and that goes from everything from like infrastructure to family structure. Like, so, yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, it's interesting also, like, okay, so we have caveat 2, and they we're going to use the Marxist definition of social class without saying it's Marxist, which I found interesting. So I'll just read it. Social class, in our view, are structural positions linked by relations of exploitation.
Mm-hmm.
The dominant class extracts labor effort from, that is to say it exploits a subordinate class, which I think is interesting. That is a Marxist definition, but it's technically narrower than the Marxist definition, because Marx and Lenin do talk about legal classes as being something that's a kind of social class that may not be about exploitation alone. Anyway, but that labor effort is at the basis of the dominant class's control over social surplus, which in turn accords it to leading a role in determining the overall development dynamic of the society in question. And I find that interesting because that's basically the Marxist definition of social class in capitalism, and they use it as social class at all. That's not a critique. I'm not, because I don't really have a problem with that. It's just interesting that they also just don't say that that's like we use the Marxist definition of class and here's what we mean by it. They're writing in the New Left Review. It's not like, but I think it's not like they're not writing for a Marxist or at least a Marxist friendly audience. Although it's interesting that they bring up Eric Olin Wright's analytical Marxist work on trying to map out the different theories of class and come up with a cohesive theory that adds Bourdieu and Weber back into Marx, which is if you read his book Understanding Class, I think it's interesting. I ultimately think it doesn't work, but I think what he's trying to do is interesting, and the reason why it doesn't work is they're not. He admits that this what these groups mean by class is different, but then trying to read them as overlaying on top of each other, he tries to come up with schemas for it, and the schemas aren't really all that explanatory. Although it does come up with some, he does make some interesting points. For example, he separates exploitation and domination and oppression as different things. Eric Olin Wright does. And he talks about one of the reasons why people hate their bosses more than they hate the owners of their businesses is because domination is more immediately perceivable than exploitation, even though exploitation is ultimately probably more important.
Yeah. Just tangibly, you're going to hate the guy you see rather than the guy you don't.
Right. So you're always going to hate your boss, even if your boss isn't your owner. Like, but how do you? They also define class politics in an interesting way, because this is when they bring in Marxists. Electoral and Wright's work constitutes a tacit admission of this in his class map, which organized according to the criterion of property, authority, and expertise, which is unrelated to his underlying Marxist theory of what class is, a set of interlocking positions constituted by relations of exploitation. Thus, under capitalist conditions, there may be gaping differences in life chances, income, and lifestyle within the working class. Indeed, this is a normal course of affairs. We should expect real class relations to be almost invisible as an everyday reality to most social actors most of the time, which I actually think that's true enough. Like, and Marx talks about that actually in his early, like the alienation from the worker, something he talks a lot about in early Marx. So like that, it's not like Marx doesn't have a way to talk about it. But secondly, and relatedly, in our uses, the expression class politics refers to politicalizations of the main relationship of exploitation and the class structure under discussion. So basically, the only class politics would be socialist, non-socialist class politics, according to this, really. In capitalist society, this means the politicization of labor capital relationships, and in particular, attempts to exert political control over social surpluses invested. Class politics, in this sense, is a rare event. In advanced capitalist societies, most politics tends to be non-class politics, as explained in thesis 1 below. What do you... I want to agree with this, and I actually think some of our analysis that we came into this with actually kind of tells us that. Like, sometimes it's really hard to explain American politics purely in terms of class. We might want to, and also the counter tendency that Marxists had, particularly in the 1980s, which was just to go Lukács, but they don't have class consciousness, so they're voting against their interests, which is later picked up by liberals.
What's wrong with Kansas?
Yeah, the what's wrong with Kansas thesis. Interesting, people miss that. Like Tom Frank totally abandons that. But so that like class politics is, I don't know. I mean, in a way, I think that distinction is interesting, but it does mean that like a lot of things that we think of as classed political actions don't count under that definition, because they're not fundamentally about the relationship of exploitation.
Yeah,
it's one of those things. Like I don't disagree with the statement that class politics is rare in American politics. And I want to say they go into it later where they talk about maybe they're I'm not sure if it was them or Karp's response to them, but they're like that so much of like the New Deal, like the New Deal didn't emerge because of like strongly, highly organized class interests, right? The New Deal emerged over other variables that just so happened to benefit the working class, right? It wasn't like the working class was in the streets demanding the New Deal or something.
Although I think Michael Lind says that the working class was about to be in the streets, and so it had to be conceded in the way that like, but I think there's some truth. I mean, the problem with the 1930s is like you have three comorbid dependents. You have a massive working class movement that actually kind of gets stopped by the Great Depression, but it seems like it could come back at any moment. I mean, working class anarchists were killing people. I mean, like it was a thing. You have the Soviet Union is fucking scary and it's real, and you have like a total breakdown of profitability, which they had seen before, but in a way that was like, it seemed like there wasn't an easy way out of it, and it wasn't just in one country anymore. Like what makes the Great Depression great is not that it's
big.
It's not just that it's big. I mean, it is big, but it's also that it's international in a way that, like, there were a bunch of very serious depressions in Europe and the America between 1850 and 1910.
Yeah.
But they tended to be limited to a couple of countries at a time. Like, it wasn't everywhere all at once in the same way.
Just great as in, great here as in the more historical description of either Britain or Alexander, of like, expansive and beyond just your local domain, kingdom, nation, whatever. Yeah.
I think the other thing that's different is we have to think about the prosperity of the 1920s itself was actually for the United States was actually a weird off. You didn't have consumer society growing in any time in the 18th century at that quick of a level, even when you had massive production. And you did in the 1920s, and then it died really fucking fast. It was like bam, like. So that's like the shock of it is probably bigger than the like actual economic impact of it. Although it's huge, I'm not denying that, but like I think like the Long Depression and like I think the 1870s was probably actually worse in terms of actual like immiseration or whatever.
Yeah,
but,
that was. I think even like Tom Hartman has talked about that too. Yeah.
But it wouldn't have been from you're not falling from as far as fast either. And so that's something to think about. And it also is interesting. I did see, this is not from a Marxist, this is from Peter Turchin of all people. But he maps out that the only time the capitalist ever took a hit on during a depression and during the recovery where they didn't just keep growing the entire time in accumulation is actually the 1930s and 1940s and the 1950s. Like at that time period, the ownership class took a hit that was actually as big or bigger than what hit the average person. That is not the case in the 19th century at all, and it's also not the case post 1960. And that's an interesting thing. I mean, that's like, a lot of Marxists say that FDR killed the revolution, and I think they're partly right, but they're also like, but there's something emerged out of that hadn't existed before and hasn't existed really since, honestly, since like Johnson failed to, do whatever he was trying to do.
Yeah. I wonder how much of it do you think was just the, not just the singular event, but the compilation of just wartime mobilization of like having this huge, like grand campaign, but also narrative that was of a scale that was like so expansive, hitting at the same time that you had all these other elements that were happening at the same time, that you needed something that this barely press. I mean, it slightly precedented, but never on that scale. But it's just all of a sudden it's just this newish thing on this like order of magnitude that was kind of newish.
What's the thing we're talking about here? The size of the state, because that's the only thing that like really, really increases. Like,
I think the size
World War II, the World War I and World War II, you just have this, and actually most of the growth in the state comes in World War I. Like, it just becomes a much more massive apparatus.
That's true.
Like, although I think that's part of what makes what FDR is trying to do even possible is World War I had already expanded the state like dramatically. But that was not just true for the United States. Like the state have expanded in Europe too. Like, and actually that's what Bukharin was writing about in like the 1910s. Is like, look at this, like the integration of capital with the state is not something anyone saw to the extent, and they see it in the buildup to World War I, and it kind of maintains. And what I find interesting, and this is one of the problems of like the David Harvey narrative of neoliberalism. I don't know, Jason, you haven't heard me rant about this, but I kind of think David Harvey's done damage to political economy.
I wouldn't disagree. Yeah.
Is that neoliberalism doesn't actually end the size of the state at all. It actually expands it. It just makes the state like a broker of contracts as opposed to a provider of services. But interestingly, it doesn't even shrink the state's like employment of people. Like it's
yeah,
yeah.
And that's also part of what thinking about that was making me wonder if people's sense of that's what it actually was just because that was the, for lack of a word, like branding that the conservative, you're in like more like Frank Luntz, Jonah Goldberg type, conservative types in like the 90s and the W era at the time that they were talking about we mentioned we get Gingrich who would go on about getting big government off your back or something like that.
One
And
problem that we've had with leftists, Jeremy, is leftists tend to take conservatives at face value. Like they tend to believe what conservatives say for some fucking reason I don't understand.
I would say a lot of I would say that that's a problem more generalized to non-conservatives, but yeah, to any non-conservative.
Yeah, okay, but like just in general, like everyone's like free market. I'm like, I remember when they started talking about charter schools, and Jason doesn't know this, but I used to be a paleo conservative, and I was always like, charter schools are the worst of both worlds. Like that's a private market that has no competition. That also is dependent on public funds. It's basically nothing but rent seeking. Like from all the market stuff you guys have taught me, that's a terrible idea, and yet all of you push it. That was one of the first things that I was like, y'all are full of shit. Like, there's a lot of things. I mean, that's not what broke me out of conservatism, but that was one of the first things that I started rejecting any of the conservative views of economics, because I just realized that like what they were pushing was public-private partnerships that were totally like they're the whole moral hazard concern, which after 2007 no one should take seriously, but even when you start talking about like privatized monopoly utilities, privatized military contractors, privatized charter schools, that's all rife with nothing but moral hazard, even from a conservative point of view. So why the fuck are they pushing it? And you realize, oh, they don't mean this free market stuff really at all. This is really about something else. Like,
yeah, this is this actually gets to like kind of a larger point that I've been thinking of like almost the weakness of, let's say, there's liberal culture, and because a lot of also American leftist culture, because a lot of them American leftists were former liberals, but it's kind of it is almost like being, because especially if you're self-radicalized, or you learn about the stuff through what people say, you learn about the stuff through media, so there's a lot of attention as to, and a lot of credence as to this particular liberal format of, okay, we you give your ideology, and you give your reasons for this, and you act from this, and it's kind of, and then so to understand how this stuff works, you just listen to what people say, and like, okay, wait a minute, how come, why are they doing this if they say that? It's kind of, I mean, it's the I was listening to a Majority Report today, and Emma Vigeland just kind of like at 3 different points was almost like her criticism was almost like trying to hit Republican types on like on like trying to like buy your logic, or like hit them on hypocrisy or something like that, and it's like that doesn't work. That kind of that only that kind of thinking only works with a very relatively like a particular chunk of American political life.
it only works with dumbass liberals. I don't like, because I don't even think most Democrats actually operate that way. Like, hypocrisy is irrelevant to most people when the actual comes to power. But I do think, like, Jason's right, that we first saw that blatantly. Like, it's always been kind of true, but like, it's blatant after
94?
after 94, after Gingrich.
94,
It's just
Right.
It's just completely blatant after that.
Well, 94 is where you also, when you get like, that's when Atwater's dead, so Frank Luntz shows up, and that's when you get the whole like eventually, it should, even back then, them throwing around like family values, quote unquote, and then, like and people are like, wait a minute, if you're for family values, yada yada yada, insert then the next 30 years of
of the where to Trump, where like you can literally have someone have an affair with a porn star and it doesn't fucking matter. I mean, and also it makes, I'm gonna be honest, I don't imagine Me Tooing a politician is gonna work again. For good and ill. It didn't, like, it took a lot more than that to take down Cuomo, for example. And so I think that's interesting. So this leads us, we haven't even got the thesis one. This is the thesis one, which I think is like,
well, before that, if you don't mind, I was going to say, like, it kind of, because you got right to it, and then we didn't get there. Like, you know, they introduced thesis one by saying that, you know, what they really mean is they set us up with what they mean by political capitalism, right? Is that it's a let me make sure I'm saying it correctly. It is, our argument is that a new structure, because you said, like, they go back to the very sort of traditional Marxist definition of class, right? You know, and then they're like, our argument is that a new structure of exploitation is in the process of emerging in the advanced capitalist world. Accordingly, we must also be witnessing the emergence of a new class structure, acts around relations of politically engineered upward redistribution, and which is, you know, what launches thesis one. And you know, well, I think that's a question in and of itself. Are we seeing a new form of extraction of surplus value, or, you know,
are we seeing something completely different, which is lots of fictitious capital being given to people?
Yeah. I mean, because I mean, the redistribution of wealth, you know, like, as we've said a couple times in different ways, like, it's not like that didn't start in the 70s or whatever, right? Like, it had been going on. It's been going on. Is there something markedly new about that redistribution and that extraction? You know, and I think that's, like, you know, if I kind of put my reading of this into one bullet point, would be that they say that we're witnessing a new form of extraction, and that's what the theses are kind of outlining. Like, here are our theoretical assumptions as to why we think that is so. And, you know, it's interesting if the theses support that claim or not. Because I'm not convinced that what they have here has me agreeing with them, but I also don't walk away from it going, well, this is bullshit, and they're full of it. You know what I mean? Like, there's some, like, I think you were saying that there's something here. They're asking, I think, important questions and chewing on important things, but I'm not sure that what they have here land, like, I don't know they quite stick the landing, if that makes sense. But
right,
and maybe that's the open-ended thing that we kind of hang there above us as we finally emerge into the theses themselves. But
so one thing I have to point out, that, like, one of the things about breaking out neoliberalism and what they're talking about is actually there's a continuity there between what we're going to describe as neoliberal forms and what we're going to describe as, like, maybe post-neoliberal, because I don't have a better fucking word for it. So in Fordism in the United States, you had the development of public-private partnerships, but labor has a seat at the table. The real difference between Fordism and neoliberalism is not like Fordism was social democracy, or even social democracy in Europe was social democracy as it was classically understood, is that labor had an informal but very real seat at the table for how society was run. It was considered and, you know, important. In the 70s, starting with the crisis and through the financialization, and this is capstone in Thatcher and Reagan, but it really begins before them. It really starts beginning, you know, as possibly as early as Gerald Furl, but definitely by the time you get to Carter. Labor starts being removed from the table. All right. Then there's this increase in public-private partnerships, and you see public functions privatized, but not put on the open market in a real way. It's not like it's not like there's really market competition. There's all these, like, monopoly guarantors and this, that, and the other. So that is a real wealth distribution upwards. But that begins in the 70s.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that starts as a way to restore profitability to the entire system. There really is a profitability crisis in the 70s.
Yeah.
Like, that's the one thing every economist I know agrees with. They disagree with why. A lot of, like, Keynesians and monetary theorists, people will say it's a policy issue. I don't think so, but I know why they say that. But they all agree that it happened, right?
Yeah. That's the emergence of that competition you were talking about earlier, right? Like,
right, it's a competition.
Labor's at the table, and there's a significant or a substantive middle for you to fight over politically, because there's no competition, there's no conflict, right? Like, everyone's prospering.
Right.
Tax rates were super high during Fordism, right? But
right.
as competitors emerge, and the capitalist zero-sum game is like, well, if we're going to start losing to competitors, we get, bye, labor. Thanks for working with us for this time period, but we're going to have to sort of change our game here, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I also think they have a point about underdetermining class politics, as they say in this thesis one. I think this is actually interestingly true, but it's not just true for now. Like, the major competitor to the United States is not an economic competitor; it's a political one, and that's the Soviet Union and China existing. Like, so not only do you have no competition, you also have a big scary outside that you don't want to come in and like have American workers agree with. So those two conditions together means, okay, we got to keep them at the table. The Soviet Union's a threat. They could, like, they're not offering a better life, but theoretically they could. We gotta provide a better life than that. But there's no economic competition to really push back on us. And, Europe's integrated into this. And we're also making sure that Latin America stays underdeveloped. Like, and we're competing in Southeast Asia. Global South generally. I point out from the U.S. perspective, we actually don't fuck with Africa that much in this time period.
Europe's doing a lot of the fucking there.
Yeah, we leave that to the French, basically.
Yeah. I was gonna say that. Yeah, that's what the French were for. Yeah.
But yeah, as a whole, the West is like, what I find interesting. Like, I like talking about Maoist, their worldist as an example. If they were ever correct, they're correct in this time period. That's where something like what they're describing was actually true. Like. But it lasts for so little of a period of time. That's the other thing that I'm like, you're literally talking about 1948 to like 1967, and then the oil crisis hits and it fucking breaks. Like but it's been breaking. Like, again, we tend to attribute it to the oil crisis, but you actually start seeing problems around 1967, 1966. That's why Nanterre happens. That's why 1968 happens in France. Like, you see unemployment increases from like 2% to 3%, which is crazy to think that would lead to that now. But like, you do see beginnings of stress on the system. There's disorder and a very kind of post-imperial, way poorer Britain too. I mean, there's a lot going on. But I guess I'm saying that, like, there's a rupture in these time periods, but there is a continuity. Like, the state is involved in the state's always been involved in capitalism. Like, let's be honest, the enclosures are a state project.
Yeah, it doesn't go away.
But like, the level of involvement after World War I is steadily up. It's not I think there's an illusion during the 80s, 90s, early aughts neoliberal period that it's stepping back, but that's an illusion. It's not real. What's happening though is it's like only capitalists can benefit, and there's competition and blah 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 blah. Then 2007 happens. Well, one of the things that they don't say, because I don't think they actually want to talk about one of the ways this is different, because it's not really redistribution, is quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is not taking money from any of the tax base and giving it to corporations. It's literally using bond mechanisms to buy back debt, to create it from a quasi-governmental entity that is not really directly funded by taxpayers. So it's not, you can't, and I also don't know that they want to say that taxes are exploitation, but it's not like coming from profits created by exploitations of productive labor. Like, so I have a mechanism for what they're talking about, but they don't use that mechanism. Like, and it's because that mechanism interestingly, isn't about exploitation, which means this is not really a class politics either from their standpoint. Like their definition of class politics removes this, because I'm going to say this: Elon Musk getting super rich is because of government contracts. It's not. Yes, he exploits his workers, but he's not the richest man in the world because he exploits his workers the best.
Yeah,
He's the richest man in the world because the state gave him money.
Yeah, SpaceX launched a shit ton of spy satellites, among other things. So,
right. So that's like the mechanism that they're talking about. But then they have to explain, like, how can all this money exist and there not be profits and all this? And this is beyond the purview of what they want to deal with, I think.
Yeah.
Because that really, I think that's like, you know, but anyway, so the other thing is a new non-class but robustly material politics has emerged since the 1990s. Okay, so a material non-class politics, and this is an interesting thesis that I think is kind of true, but I don't believe in why it's true. Because it is not a class politics, because naturally neither Democrats nor Republicans seek to mobilize many workers who vote for them against capital, nor do they attempt to exert effective political control over capital, especially in the area of political capitalism. Thus, we have a formulation of material interest politics without working class politics. How do you feel about that? Because, I mean, that's also, like, by that definition, like, trade unionism's never been working class politics, by the way. Like,
seems like almost like a slippery formation that can, into which they can fit the rest of what they want to say, isn't it?
Yeah, it feels like they want to say something without, they don't want to go into specific mechanisms, like, for example, what I talked about with QE, like when, like, asset inflation and stuff like that. And I find that interesting because that's actually closer to what Brenner was talking about in, like, techno-neo-feudalism. But they want to they want to say that, like, this hasn't over. I know part of it, and I only know this because, like, Sean asked Dylan Riley to, on a show. They don't think the primary contradiction of capitalism has been solved. This is not like Paul Sweezy in the 1970s saying monopoly capital has ended the primary contradiction of capitalism, because we all are eating crow over that. But they also want, they want to talk about this, like, non-class politics, but it's got material interest, but we don't know how the rich are getting richer. Like, so it may be about redistribution, but it may not be. But we have to do more than we can. I think there's more economic legwork they'd have to do to justify that. And then there's more sociological legwork they'd have to do to, like, tie in, the kinds of other stuff we talked about, like, the integration of different subgroups like Black people into electoral politics, racial backlash, which they touch but don't totally get into. What material groundings there might be material interest in racial backlash. How do we deal with that? Like, but they argue that this is, what's interesting is they kind of argue that capitalism is always underdetermined class politics. And I'll give you that right here. This underdetermination inherent to the structure of relations of exploitation under capitalism is particularly acute in the U.S. for historical reasons, two of which were worth emphasizing: the emergence from the 1870s of Jim Crow and mass immigration, which created a basis for ethnic stratification. So I guess, they're trying to, like, say, hey, like, identity politics may be shitty, but it's rooted in material conditions. Let's talk about that. Which I think is fine, actually. That's smart. But again, like, okay, why is that only true in America? I mean, like, we've all been dealing with the fact that like, actually the United States was one of the only countries in the Second International that voted against the war of World War I. I mean, like, how do you explain that if it's only a U.S. phenomenon? It's not. Like, it's particularly bad in the U.S., but it's not unique to it. And the reason why it's particularly bad is probably settler colonial stuff and world system stuff, which, given from that's an opposing school of thought, I guess that's why they don't incorporate it. I don't know. I'm maybe reading too much into that.
Shit gets messy, yeah.
Yeah. So So we're an hour and a half in, and we have gotten through thesis 1. So we're going to do one more, and then maybe we can reconvene for the rest of them.
This is fun. Yeah, go for it. Yeah, this is kind of I will say this: we're going about as fast as I thought we would. So, I am. I'm not disappointed.
We're not even through thesis 1. We've just touched it.
Yeah, thesis 1 is multiple sections. Actually, it's like
thesis 1 is the long one. Yeah, and then they kind of shotgun through. By the time they're at 4, they're like, and here's 4, 5, 6, and 7.
Yeah, it's actually kind of funny because you could tell they're running out of steam in the argument. And I'm like, because one of the theses I was like, this thesis needs to be the one you elaborate the most. I think it's like 5.
Yeah.
And I'm like, and you gave me 3 paragraphs. Like, all right. So I think this is interesting. We're still on thesis 1. At the most abstract levels, workers pursuing their economic interest under capitalism can choose between 2 main strategies: individualism or individualist, and class collaborationist or collective class-based action. The first strategy is in some ways the most natural one. Workers pursue their own interests as owners of a special commodity, their labor power. All right. So this is, I think they're actually saying that, like, the individualist, alienation and working class people is not unique to the United States. And it's also like not entirely irrational, unlike what some Marxists have assumed. And then the collective class-based action one is actually interesting because they're actually arguing that it's not class politics because it's inherently class collaborationist, which I mean, I want to say that they're putting in different words classical Marxist positions, actually, but I think ones that we're kind of uncomfortable with. Because
I'm sorry, go on. I didn't mean, sorry.
No, it's just like the whole Marxist relationship to labor unions is really complicated.
Yeah.
And it's for this reason.
This is where correct me, right? This is where they're saying, like, I remember this standing out because they're basically saying, like, oh, well, workers face the collective action problem, right? Mm-hmm. Do they take an individualist approach, or do they take collective action? That's where, he says, like, the example of collective action, right, is collective bargaining, and therein, like, so I remember this, but but it's not class politics because, again, this distinction is interesting because, again, it's like it's building the formula here, right? Like you said, like under this interpretation, union activity isn't class activity, right? Because when my union and I, who are at the bargaining table right now, we are bargaining for our particular interest as a subset of the working class, right? Allegedly, and not for the entirety of the working class. So
right.
I'm partaking in some collective action only to see my own personal individual benefits, right? Not actually to see some sort of moving of the needle for the working class, which is maybe not necessarily wrong, but for lack of a better way to think of it, like perhaps overly cynical. I don't know.
The only way that I don't think it's just that. I think, according to this, class politics could only be about overthrowing the exploitation relationship.
The system, right. Like fundamentally changing the mode of production, right? That's right. The only class politics we would have, right? Yeah.
So basically, there can be no reformist, or even there should be no reformist class politics. I don't disagree with them that, like, organizing at the table is, technically speaking, class collaborationist. It is. We're trying to get a better deal in a system that's fundamentally going to be exploitative. Everyone knows that.
Yeah.
But to say that it's not, it's just like, let's just be honest. I think it is a form of class politics. It's just not revolutionary class politics, and you're trying to bracket it out.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I read this and I'm like, well, in terms of praxis, what does this mean, right? Like, I can't just go organize the fucking revolution tomorrow, right? But I can connect with my union, right? And we can collectively seek our interests. And then as other workers see, oh, wow, that union made big gains and look at their contract and their material improvements. Oh, this other union did that and they've had big gains and had improved their material. Like the idea of, pushing people, like it's been popular the last few years. Like every worker should have a union, right? Like there's a reason. I think for praxis, there's a reason you shift to that, because, like you said, we're not going, like, we have mega people in our union, right? Like, I've sat around with them, and I don't give a shit about all this woke stuff. Like, let's just get better wages and better healthcare. It's like, okay, yeah, so that's where you're going to connect, right? I'm not going to build class consciousness with these other people through arguing about, arguing in the terms of, if you will, or with the language of, white privilege or something, right? But I can build collectivity with these people through, like, yeah, you're right, let's get fucking better wages and better healthcare right now. You know what I mean? So it's like, okay, yes, if it's not revolutionary, but if you're telling me it's not class politics, or then I don't, I think the Venn diagram is different in my mind than I think it is in theirs, right? Like, there's some sort of overlap there that I don't know. Yeah, like I said, it almost reads too cynical to me, but that's not the right word.
They want to present class politics as a simple binary.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I think.
There's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of, like, is and isn't in here.
And one of the things I think is interesting about that is, like, even classical Marxists, like, when they talk about trade union consciousness or whatever, they're not saying it's not a class politics. They're saying it's like an insufficient class politics. Like, Like, and you need more than that. And I don't think any of us here would disagree with that. But it's like, but there's a reason if unions never let, like, I want to be, like, completely open about the legal history here. One of the reasons why American unions suck in a different way than the way most unions suck, and I do, I'm a trade unionist too. I'm a trade rep. I'm not just, like, a dues payer. So when I say unions suck, it's not because I don't believe in them. It's just because I've dealt with them for a long time. But it's still better to have one than not have one, as almost everyone in the United States now knows. But one of the reasons why they suck, particularly in America, is Taft-Hartley, because it actually is designed to make organizing for the class as a whole are turning the unions into a political party, which is how, like, the SPD and the British Labour Party and the Israeli Labour Party, like, that's where they come from. It's designed to make sure that never happens through the unions. It has to happen. If it's going to happen in the United States, legally, you either have to have a political revolution a la Bernie, which Jeremy knows I was skeptical of before it was cool. But one of the things about that is, if you change Taft-Hartley, if you got rid of that law, solidarity striking and all that becomes legal, the union bureaucracy may still not do it, but there's no longer a legal excuse for them not to do it. And that fundamentally changes the entire affair. Like, and yeah, I mean, unions in Europe also suck in different ways in the way they get integrated to the state or this, that, and the other. They actually aren't as willing to organize in general for that reason. If you ever dealt with European organizers, they tend to be a little bit more lackadaisical because they're used to other people doing the work for them.
Yeah, isn't it like this? Like, I'm trying to remember if this is particularly glaring. If this was it Sweden or France, and I'm guessing probably France, where just because of how, like, the particular, like, union / state setup there, and how different, like, it's much more built up, but it's also different from here.
Well, that's all of Europe, but France and Sweden are very different from each other on that regard. Sweden,
you get a lot of, like,
built into the state almost.
Like, in Germany in particular, right? Like their auto unions, like, they bargain with the state directly, right, as an industry, as opposed to bargaining with the employers, right? Like, they don't go to the table and sit down across from BMW and Mercedes or whatever. They sit at the table across from the state and representatives of those entities, right? And bargain. Yeah, it's I don't know, fundamentally different beast. I'm not sure, but it's a very different beast. Yeah,
I think it's fundamentally different. I mean, because they also, like, you're not union, then you're not negotiating for a specific, like, that takes care of a problem in American unionizing where, like, say Toyota can come in and undercut provide better jobs temporarily than the unionized auto shops in Detroit, like which they did, like particularly when you
North Carolina,
yeah
Gung Ho. You guys remember? Are you familiar with that movie?
yeah.
Yeah.
That section, like total sectional bargaining, does that. However, and I think what you're thinking of is like Sweden, where the unions actually were used by the government to suppress wages.
Yeah, I think you've definitely mentioned that before.
That didn't happen in France.
Okay.
And in Sweden, that was actually the logic for that wasn't necessarily anti-socialist or anything. It was that they were trying to fight inflation, and they thought fighting inflation would actually help the worker more than the pay raises. So that was the justification, but it ended up making unions more unpopular, and that's why there was a partial neoliberalization in Sweden in the 80s in response to that. That's why it was popular. So like, that's why I say like different unions suck in different ways, but I'd rather be in a European union than an American one almost any day, and I'd rather be in an American union than not be in one most of the time. Like, so it's like I bitch about the unions all the time, but I'm like, but I'm in it. I'm a dues paying member. Like, and I actually I don't just get my dues. I participate in it. I'm a rep. Like it comes from a place of like, this is a shitty organization, but it's also the best one we have.
And it's my shitty organization.
Yeah, God damn it. Like, and I want to make it more ours, not less ours, right? I want to get to this alternative bit's actually interesting. And yeah, I don't, we might not even finish thesis 1. The alternative is working class politics. Worker pursues a class strategy which links redistributed demands to a broader attempt to exert political control over the social surplus produced by workers and appropriated by capital. I guess that is slightly broader than just have the revolution, but it's not a lot broader. It literally would only apply to like European social democracy from like 1900 to like 1960, barring out the war, to some degree, because there are political demands and like unions develop like dual power and parasocial institutions that later become organs of the state, but initially are separate from them and stuff like that. So I guess they would consider that class politics, but I get, like there's the legal thing in the room. It's like, well, the reason why that doesn't happen in America is literally illegal.
Yeah.
Like it's like, it's not an option unless you're willing to go an illegalist route, which no recognized trade union with National Labor Relations board recognition would ever risk. Now, admittedly, I'm also going to asterisk that more people who are in unions aren't covered by the National Labor Relations Act than are. Because of the growth of public sector unions, because of nurses being semi-exempted, even though they do have some representation on the National Labor Relations Board, but they're like there's all kinds of exemptions in the National Labor Relations Act to them. We just got reminded that railway workers and other logistic workers are exempted from the National Labor Relations Act pretty hard.
Hard way to learn that one, yeah, for a lot of folks.
So it's, there's actually increasingly in American life, not like, it's kind of sadly ironic. There's probably more unions that aren't covered by the National Labor Relations Board, but particularly when you consider the largest unionized sector is cops. Although I don't think they're separate from, for the most part, they're separate from the AFL-CIO. But when people were talking about why doesn't the AFL-CIO kick out the few cop unions that are tied to it, I'm like, because that's the largest unionized sector in the country, my dudes. Like, as gross as that is, but it's true.
I think I'll hear they're connected to AFSCME. I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, they're in other organizations, but they're usually, most of them aren't in the AFL-CIO.
Oh yeah.
So I guess, like, okay, so their definition definitely includes revolution, also includes, like, I guess, like, the formation of labor parties and shit, right? Like, that would also count as class politics for them. But would there be class politics anywhere in the world by their definition right now? I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
Like, not even like workers' uprisings in China and stuff would count for them. Like, that still doesn't actually really count for them. So, so that's it. That's and interesting. I haven't heard people talk about this part of this essay, but this is kind of a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
well, and it's also interesting. I see two interesting points here. One, I'm not sure what is class politics then, right? If anything, and two, the two examples they use, mid 30s with the Wagner Act, and then 60s to 70s with like the VRA. It's like, well, what makes the civil rights movement fundamentally working class in a way that other things that I would think of as working class aren't? It's, I don't know, it's a weird distinction.
Yeah, I actually think their examples disprove their definition.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I'm not crazy. Okay. I was wondering if I felt something hit my mind here, and I couldn't quite put it in words. Yeah.
I do think the civil rights movement is partly a workers' movement, partly, but I don't think it meets their threshold for class politics. Actually.
Yeah. Okay.
Because it doesn't aim to overthrow the fundamental relations of production. It just aims to let certain people be exploited the same way.
Yeah, exactly. Like let's just bring these other people into the fold. Like they're excluded. Like they're just excluded. Like let's bring, like, we want these people in the game too. Let's not change the game. Let's just add these people to the game, right?
Like, it is a game changing for like women and Black people specifically, but it's just saying that like all over the country you can be included, not just like sporadically. And honestly, it also doesn't actually achieve that, but like okay, and I think that yeah, that's class struggle, but I don't think it actually rises to what their definition demands.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess you could kind of expand it out, but if you start expanding it out to cover like the civil rights movement, then you start expanding out to cover all kinds of shit, like that, like, because you could argue that like BLM is a class politics from that perspective, and I think somewhat justly, but I don't think that, I think they're explicitly excluding that, because then that means that class politics isn't that uncommon.
Yeah.
Like, so, I kind of think, I don't know, this is where their whole binary definition just falls apart, where I think like we really should think of this. I know this is a cop-out answer for a lot of people, but there is a spectrum of class politics.
Mm-hmm.
And these things are in different places on the spectrum of class politics. Like, it's not like there's class politics and non-class politics. There's varieties of all this, and it just, I think though that's not as easy to polemicize about. And they also separate class politics from class struggle, which is actually something that's kind of different from other Marxists.
Yeah.
That's section 5, but we're still under the first thesis. Like, since the 2000s, there has been an uptick in class struggle, but the members of the working class continue to pursue their interests overwhelmingly as owners of labor power rather than as a class. So it's like there's been a mass uptick in class struggle from like Occupy to the Sanders campaign to whatever, but it's not political, because it's just weird, because I'm like, actually, it seems like it's more political now than it was in the unions by the definition that you gave, because a lot of people have taken we have to repoliticize thing and then enter the unions to do this, as opposed to the traditional, like, let's just get our unions to do sectional bargaining, like, or something like that. Like, I don't know. I think their distinctions actually cause more problems than it clarifies.
Well, and it's interesting to say that like there's an increase in class struggle, but not in class politics. Was like, is it really class struggle then, or is it just like economic resentment or economic frustration or economic alienation? Like,
right,
there's a rising class struggle, but not a congruent rise in class politics. It's like, okay, well, like, all right, so there's no class politics, so that doesn't exist apparently, but the class struggle does exist. So what does that tell us then?
There's just more posting. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. This is a weird. Like, it's the longest part of the essay, and it's the weirdest part of the essay for sure.
Yeah. I mean, they make some concessions that I like before we get to this section, they talk about, despite the talk of identity talks and post-material values, U.S. politics has a clear material mass base, and I guess they also would imply, so like that includes racial identity and other kinds of politics, which I think is a nice, because I'm a class firstist. I'm not a class reductionist, and I always talk about this like class is the primary contradiction. But there's all kinds of other contradictions that divide up the working class that you have to deal with: race, gender, region, credentialization, cartelization, just competing economic interests, like all that shit. Really matters when you're talking about like how immediate like the experience of class works out for people. And I like that they are trying to get us to like re-include that and not be super vulgar, and also but not like say, well, the identity politics as like, what is it that liberals always say to me, all politics is identity politics, and I'm like, okay,
yeah,
sure, I guess, depending on how you define identity. I don't know. But yeah, and it's funny because there's been an uptick in class struggle, but that paragraph is also, that's super important, right? If you're going to talk about how there's like no class politics, but there is class struggle, but then you only give us a fucking paragraph about that.
Yeah,
like,
and then isn't this where they shift gears then to talk about how they back up their sense that basically like 80% of us are working class, right? Like 80% of it, yeah. So is that why there's an increase in class struggle? Because so much of us are working class, and we're starting to be vocally pissed off about economic inadequacies, but because there are cleavages in that 80%, we don't actually have class politics, because we then just fall back to identity or interest-based politics that divide us amongst ourselves.
That's not what they say, but that, to me, that would actually be a clearer thesis. Like you have like the and it's interesting because socialists, since the loss of the Brenner campaign, and run in the other direction, but like, because increasingly, since we've had these PMC debates, there's been people who just want to limit who actually counts as working class to like only productive sector workers in industrial sector and logistics. So I'm like, only like what, 10% of the population on a good day. Yet we're all wage earners now. So how the fuck does that work? Like very few, like there's increasingly not even that much petty bourgeoisie left. What, so what is it? Oh, that's a professional managerial class. Well, who the fuck is that really? Like, my problem with that is just like, it's a floating signifier, like, because sometimes it's everybody who has a credential, but sometimes it's like actual elites within the class strata. Sometimes it also includes people who are technically petty bourgeois anyway. Like
I mean, by their distinction, I feel like, I read it and I'm like, okay, well, I'm credentialed labor. I get that. And I guess I work closely with the PMC, right? Because the managers who make more than me, like they get to do what they do because I provide all the labor and analysis that they make decisions with, right? So like, I'm not the PMC. I'm under the dragon's wing. And that place, that position.
Well, also when they talk about this period, they actually don't really talk about the PMC, even though they posit them as existing. Like, they don't use that terminology because they don't want to deal with it.
That's true.
But yeah, the two main political parties no longer appeal as alternative growth models, but rather as different fiscal coalitions. But the thing is, they were different fiscal like to me, this is where Tim Barker really has a good point. That's actually the norm.
So they kind of always were, weren't they? Plus, they really do spend like a lot of like this this paragraph bringing in growth in ways that they don't like elsewhere.
Well, because they're trying
Part
to
of their typology.
they're trying to tie this back into like a sound Marxist typology, like the economic growth and the rates and decline of profits really matter for this. And I think that's actually a good impulse. But really the only time where you have alternative growth models on the table, it like there's a consensus between, say, Eisenhower and to Johnson. Like, and actually the person who offers an alternative growth model is one of the person that they bracketed out, which is JFK, who in some ways is a proto-neoliberal. And people don't like pay attention to that, but like he's the first person who really starts dropping marginal growth tax. He starts trying to introduce competitive stuff into like democratic policy. Like he's actually in some ways, until right before his death, a more virulent anti-communist than Eisenhower.
Yeah.
If only to prove his credentials. And so, yeah, there actually is kind of an alternative pattern on the table, but there's remarkable consensus in both parties too, between the Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon camp period. Like that's when the liberal consensus is like a bipartisan project. So again, it means that it doesn't really fit. They're not two different economic paradigms. They're like slight differences in what groups you favor in the economic paradigm, which means it's not really that different.
They're yeah, it's almost like the same two different sets of EQ settings or something, where it's kind of like, ultimately the same kind of thing, only like slight variations and along the way with different things emphasized.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we're seeing. So I don't know. I just don't think it doesn't seem like it's actually as big of a I think there is a shift, right? And they're right that there's a shift, but it's not one of like complete difference. It's like one of a difference in emphasis or something. Because I don't yeah, Jason, we were talking about how
I was listening. Yeah.
Do you believe do you think I'm right about that? I don't think there really was alternative economic paradigms presented between the Republican and Democrats in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s.
That post-war period, like everyone's winning. I mean, I think it's an interesting point to call JFK like a proto-neoliberal. Domestically, I think what JFK's president during the emergence of the Southern strategy, right? So again, he wants to sort of bring Black people into the fold a little more, which domestically gives him some enemies, but
he's still keeping the Dixiecrats in, and the Dixiecrats also are proto-neoliberals.
He's still holding that core in the middle. Yeah, there's not a lot of variance there.
Yeah, I mean, like he's the only real difference, and it's not even that different, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I agree with you. It's one of like reducing marginal tax rates, returning some stuff to the private economy. That's about it.
And like you said, his particular presidency, as short as it was, with he certainly wasn't like breaking from the I'm not a bleeding heart pinko, right? Like I am I'm vehemently anti-communist, right? So much so that I'm gonna exaggerate it in some ways, right?
I'm gonna sick my brother. The RFK was AG, wasn't he? Was Attorney General for a while, but no, because I'm trying to remember.
Bobby was his AG at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, but it wasn't like both, like the two of them were kind of like, especially like in like during part of the 50s, were particularly almost like they really leaned into the anti-communist thing to go after, just to, I don't know, the kind of like stave off criticism or establish the bona fides on that.
Yeah, I think it's like later on Democrats couldn't be soft on crime, right? Like you had to like kind of fake your bona fides there. Like I'm not soft on this sort of, well, in some ways abstract enemy, right? But in other ways, very real sort of geopolitical enemy. But yeah, I'm anti-communist, but I also don't want nuclear war with them. So, Bobby, get on the damn secret phone and let's figure out what's going on in Cuba.
Right. I mean, there's a whole lot of after FDR. There's a whole lot of like defensiveness in general from Democrats. I mean, you see it like it's really does start with Truman. Once Wallace is ousted as vice president, like you start seeing this turn to like signaling, you know, anti-socialism, anti-communism. I mean, not that like Truman was terrible on workers' politics. He wasn't. Like he tried to push back on stuff like fuck, I was just mentioning it. The beginnings of that fucking terrible labor bill. Taft-Hartley.
Yeah.
But he did actually help pretty much gut the Wagner Act. So
yeah.
Also, just a little bit of continuity, and I mean, it won't be quite a full circle in our conversation, but yeah, of the war ending when it did, and that midterm election being the one where all of the anti-New Deal GOP flood in and decide and fuck with a lot of post-war rebuilding plans. So, which is when we get both Taft-Hartley, but also any attempts at any sort of proper healthcare system scotched.
Yeah, well, that's why we get all this weird Fordist bullshit, like employer provided insurance, for example, being enshrined into law as a compromise. Like, that's where that comes from. It's like, and that's partly because it's being scuttled by. It's also being scuttled by Southern Democrats too. Like, to be completely honest,
bipartisan effort.
Yeah. Because while the Southern Democrats love being associated with FDR, some of FDR's policies, they were probably too good for the poors and the black folks, so got to tamp down on that. And so that's why you see like something like proto-neoliberalism and like the Dixiecrats too. But it's interesting. Johnson's the odd man out here because he's the person who picks back up all the almost tries to pick back up the Wallace style progressivism while also being a virulent anti-communist and generally a weirdo.
Yeah, great society, but also the great society, but also carpet bombing.
Yeah, the great society, but let's really accelerate the war in Vietnam, and I mean, that in and of itself leads to the 68 Democratic Convention, which totally changes U.S. politics. Like, that really is a major breaking point. It's where the primary system comes from for the most part. Yeah. That's where that's when you start getting the pushback on the Electoral College. That's the only time the New Left ever has a victory in anything, and then it proceeds to lose. But neither here nor there. But it's just it's interesting. But the other thing is again, we talk about the New Left. Does the New Left politics meet their threshold of class politics? It doesn't. I'm really torn at what in U.S. history at all really meets their threshold of class politics. The Wagner Act is really all they have, and maybe Debs counts, but Debs would count for anybody. I guess also maybe the Populist Coalition under William Jennings Bryant might count by their definition. Maybe. I'm unclear on that, actually. They'd really have to spell out a lot more examples and go through a lot more of U.S. history to make this case, right? And they don't do it. And I'm already complaining when really we're almost halfway through the essay and we haven't got past thesis 1. We're 7 sections in, but we're into the first thesis.
Do you want to? It's also we're 2 hours plus into recording. You want to take a break? Let's break it off here and then meet back again to go through more of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we almost are done with thesis one. If you just want to finish that real fast.
My reading of it is, I mean, they go through a lot of parsing out some things here, but I think at this point, I think you can jump to the last paragraph of the thesis. The working class, understood as those who do not own assets and therefore must subsist on wage income, make up between 68 and 80% of all U.S. households. But this class is profoundly split by education level, sector of economic activity, and race, in quotes. And it's I don't know what, as we've been saying, I don't know what part of our political history would really fall into their definition of class politics. But then I also
don't know what part of political history where there isn't differences between education level, sector, and race.
Your distinction, we're kind of going in a circle here with it. But I get what they're framing. It's a very traditionally Marxian framing of class, right? Based on your relation in the mode of production to capital. Okay, yes. Yeah, I agree. I think by that definition, 8 out of 10 people are working class. And yes, amongst those 8 out of 10, particularly today, there's more diversity in that 80% than some people want to recognize or do recognize or whatever. But
although race is a major divider, is actually worse than the past that they're talking about.
Yeah.
So it's
where does this take us? That's kind of the thing. All right, so you've taken 8 sections of this essay to work us through your sort of research question, your framing of our current moment, to give us what you're proposing is a new understanding of capitalism and class, but it's I don't. I don't know.
It seems to be largely not new, and when it is new, it doesn't seem Marxist, or it doesn't seem like, it seems like a stretch to say how there's clean breakages here. Even though I think we can talk about Fordism, neoliberalism, whatever the fuck we're dealing with right now. Maybe entrepreneurial capitalism before Fordism, if you want to call it something. And then settler capitalism in the early stages of the country, right? You could talk about that. That's coherent. But even all of those are actually more slippery in periodization than we'd probably like.
Yeah.
But also saying this is an interesting thesis. This perspective allows us to bring together education and race in a single conceptual framework. This is actually kind of crazy. Credentialing and race can be thought of as a form of social closure that emerges within the U.S. working class, organized primarily in terms of internal redistribution. To put the point as pithily as possible, whiteness and nativeness should be understood as the BA of the non-college educated. The possession of the BA should be understood as the whiteness and nativeness of the college educated. This is the PMC thesis, while rejecting the PMC thesis. And I will read where they reject the PMC thesis.
Yeah. Well, they just lose me to your point. This perspective allows us to bring together education and race in a single conceptual framework. How? I don't.
Right, because because yes, there's a closing off to the non-college educated unless you're over a certain age.
Yeah.
And also the value of that BA is much lower to people younger than it is to people who are baby boomers. It's significantly less life earnings benefits.
Yeah.
It is still one. I mean, if you look at not they have a point that the non-college educated have seen a massive drop in their earnings potential in real terms once you adjust for inflation, and high school dropouts have seen an astronomical drop. And that seems true enough, but they're also not dealing with the fact I guess it is closure, but they're positing this in a moment where that closure is less relevant than before. What do I mean by that? Clearly, I mean, I'm a teacher, so I can tell you right now, people are beginning to not see the value in going and getting higher ed, and higher ed enrollment shows that.
Mm-hmm.
So like, and then also like, I guess they want to say like the BA should be understood as the whiteness or nativeness of the college educated. Like it's a curtailing advantage, and I get their point there, but oh my God, is that a flattening of those two differences? And it, it doesn't even deal with the fact of what is a non-white BA holder in your schema. Like, do they have all the privileges of whiteness? I doubt it. And this is and I tend to be an Adolf Reedian on these things, but I still think that's a ridiculous assertion.
I'm glad you said that, because I was going to ask you if when you read this, when I read this through the first time the other day, I especially in this paragraph where, like, as I just said, they're trying to tell me that this perspective, that this framing of the working class allows us to bring together education and race in a single framework. But I read this and I'm almost like, Bob Brenner just doesn't want to get the Adolf Reed treatment. He doesn't want to be called a class reductionist and sort of dismissed by certain parts of the left. So he's like, no, look, I understand class in such a broad way that allows for this huge swath of Americans, in this diverse swath of Americans, in an analytical framework that allows me to still try to hold my Marxist, keep my Marxist jacket on and say it's a class-based, like I'm taking a class-based approach while acknowledging the class is diverse or something. You know what I mean? And it's like, I don't know. I don't.
And it gets a problem when you see
so
the
muddy.
definitions. I'll read the one where they reject a degree on the wall, however, from prestigious an institution produces no income. In our view, any concessions to the notions of cultural capital, human capital, or professional managerial class are ultimately a capitulation to one of the oldest ideological canards of bourgeois society: the idea that such societies are made up of predominantly independent proprietors selling their wares in the market, aka that basically that there's no significant distinction between a worker and a petite bourgeoisie. That's what that. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that, as much as I disagree with the professional managerial class, I'm not sure the professional managerial class actually does that. But regardless, I'm also not sure cultural capital does that, at least not as defined by Bourdieu, honestly. But nonetheless, okay, they're limiting these new concessions. They don't want any Erical and Wright problems. But then read this thing on race is kind of it actually kind of undoes some of the U.S. working class is, of course, deeply split by race. About 70% of the population identifies as white and about 13% as black, but regional variations are wide. For example, 56% of Californians identify as white and 6% as black. Furthermore, the category of Latino or Hispanic cuts across the white category. Nationally, about 10% of the white population identifies as Hispanic or Latino, that being that non-Hispanic whites make up about 60% of the U.S. population. Meaning that non-Hispanic whites make up about 60% of the U.S. population and around 40% of the large immigrants of states of California, Texas, and Florida. These identities famously constitute a fertile terrain for non-class or status group politics, and I guess that's true. But they can't even parse from there what are the actual important racial vectors, because they also treat race as race as the same, but
as credential,
as credential, and also as to itself. So Asianness is the same as blackness in this, which is a ludicrous position to take. That's just fun to, again, I'm an Adolf Reedian in a lot of this stuff, but that's ridiculous to say. Okay, so the Indian American, the subcontinent Indian American immigrant and the native person have the same structural disclosures. I guess you could say, well, we don't mean that because there's also different levels of education. So there's
education,
but I'm but you're not putting that in a framework that's understandable. It's you make this piffy point so that you avoid being called a reductionist, or I guess also or making concessions to identity politics is actually worded in a way that avoids either accusation, but it also makes it kind of fucking meaningless.
I think that's and that's a good way to put it. We want to acknowledge identity politics, and we don't want to be class reductionists, And in the end, it's like, well, we've said a whole lot of we've written a whole lot of words that really say nothing. Like, again, or at least for me, like, I don't see the utility in any of this yet. Like, I just don't see. I don't see the use of, like, I'm not like, I don't look at this like, well, you guys, thank you so much for writing this, because now this makes X so much clearer to me, or Y so much clearer to me. I don't.
No, actually, some of the other theses I think are going to be much clearer and much more helpful.
Yeah.
But they're complicated by this fucking first one.
They're all based on this, which makes them,
which takes up the first half of the essay.
Yeah.
Well, and we're talking, like, again, I want to mention there's no mention of where the prior distinction, like political capitalism is posited, but the other subsets of capitalism aren't discussed at all as discrete subsets. They're not. Like, Fordism isn't mentioned. Is neoliberalism mentioned? I feel like it might get mentioned once, but it's not really discussed in any
Do they say it by
as a candidate descriptor, or like a political tendency?
Like as a periodization of the organization of capitalism.
No, I don't think they use it as like that. It's more of a sorting.
They don't talk about neoliberalism until the very end, when they're like, how did Biden, like, how do we have Biden here? And it's like a little bit like Hillary, like Bill and Hillary were neoliberals in this way.
So neoliberalism for them is a political project, not a political economic project.
I think that's how it's used.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that's weird. If you're, particularly when you're talking about political capitalism, because I'm like, I'm sorry, but going back to like all the way to Bukharin, there's been an observation going back to like Bukharin's book on imperialism that the state and capital get more and more enmeshed over time. Like, and sometimes it seems like they're getting decoupled, but like in reality they're not, and they're just like skipping that. It's not addressed. Yeah. And I find that, like, if you're positing like political capitalism is something brand new, and I'm like, but what about all the other periods of capitalism? Like, also, I've heard this new period of capitalism before, like,
since the mid-70s.
Well, it's funny, as we brought up neoliberalism, I did the good old fashioned Control F to see where it comes up. So it's jumping way down in the essay, but again, where they're like, how did we get here with Biden? As much as we've sort of labored on the fact that they sort of wash over this 20 years or so, they say Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign in 2016 was as strongly committed to neoliberalism as the 3 prior administrations had been. Okay, so basically this historical period you're not talking about is neoliberalism, and but you don't want to talk about it. You're saying like, well, we got to Biden because of this period of neoliberalism, but we're not talking about it as a period of neoliberalism. We're not really talking about the period at all. We're just saying there were these dominant trends, and we're going to turn an eye to part of late 20th century history, and then Joe Biden and Trump, and here we are. We have
Trumponomics and Bidenomics, which are the same but different. And I mean, we're gonna get into that because I actually think that's the area where they're actually weirdly stronger, even if their conceptualizations for it are kind of similar.
Yeah.
But it is. And actually, when they talk about the misunderstandings of the left, I'm like, you know what? I agree that we've misunderstood something fundamentally, but I don't think you've helped me understand what. You keep on hinting at like like why workers, but it's also, let's also be very specific, like why workers have not done working class politics as Marxists perceived it has been a question since literally the fucking 1920s. It's been the question since the 1920s, like the primary question. So pretending like it's a new fucking problem is weird. Like,
why is there no socialism in the U.S. is not new.
Werner Sumbaugh wrote that book in 1905.
Like, and then we've had everything from Louis Hartz to to Brenner himself talking about it for 70 years.
It's just like, so like, is this really new? I just don't know. Like, it seems to be one way an attempt to like have this grand Marxist narrative, and then another way just to explain like stuff about Biden and Trump. And honestly, I think it understands Trump better than Biden, but we'll get there. We're not going to talk about that tonight. That's just going to be my like hanger for the thing, because I think they actually weirdly believe. I think they believe more of Biden's hype than they should. So
Yeah, you're right. That definitely comes across with how they are with some of the later.
Like admittedly, we have like a bunch of shit's happened since November, but so we have hindsight, but it's just like, yeah, I don't know that Biden's really doubling down on this like deracinated, shitty, progressive neo-Keynesianism stuff, really. Like, but anyway, thank you guys for coming on. I'm gonna end the show. If you guys hung on a minute, and we'll talk about maybe our next section.
All right.